everybody, and welcome back to the Fur and Fam YouTube channel. In this week's episode, we're going to go through the steps that we took to make this shelf that's over our driver and passenger seat. So we started out by making a template and figuring out what size sheet of material would fit in here. And once we did that, we actually ended up making two of them because the first one was too small. So we made two templates and then got our measurements for the top piece, because you can see it's made out of 2 sheets of birch plywood, and got that template dialed in and cut out the top sheet. And then we made another template that we used to make the bottom sheet. The bottom piece actually is what hides the seam of the headliner where the headliner touches the bottom of the shelf, because we had to cut the headliner out above and because we wanted to spray foam under it. The other thing that we did on the shelf is mount 2 speakers. So we have 2 Kicker 6x9 3-way speakers in there, and that was because the speakers in T1N Sprinter vans really just suck, and we needed a little more sound while we were going down the road, so we added in 2 more speakers and then covered them with speaker grills so you can't see inside the speaker holes. So that does it for the quick recap. Now we're going to get into some of the time-lapse footage and show you a little bit more of what we actually did in order to make this shelf. The first step that we took was removing the big styrofoam pieces that were mounted above the B-pillar in the T1N vans. I don't know why the Sprinters of those years have them there. I've seen them in other Sprinters too, so I'm assuming that it's some sort of sound deadening, or structurally maybe in a crash you want some type of impact resistance or crumple zone there. But we're going to add a bunch of framing and do a lot of things above the driver's seat that should make it where those won't be necessary to have. So we took them out. We had to saw one side out with a drywall saw, and then the headliner actually goes all the way up to the rib in the roof, and so we took a razor blade and had to cut that out. It doesn't cut very well, especially since ours was very old, so I just trimmed it down a little bit to see what was behind it. Learned that it's really just a bunch of wiring laying behind it, so you got to be careful not to cut the wiring, especially that goes to your antenna. So one of the things we wanted in our van is a shelf over the driver's seat. So I've already cut away some of the headliner here. What I wanted to do is basically trim that down all the way to where the shelf will be, because it actually loses a lot of space. As you can see, when it's pushed all the way up, there's a good 3-4 inches of space there you can't utilize. So that's one of the reasons that we wanted to cut this out, and basically what we're going to do is make it where the shelf sits on this part of the frame. So we're going to take a razor blade and cut all the way around the headliner. And end up back over here at this point right here. And so, like I said, the shelf has a place to sit on both sides, and we'll use some self-tapping sheet metal screws to put it in place permanently. I took the razor blade here and did my best to maintain a level plane as I was cutting. That's something, it was pretty difficult, especially through the corners, to keep it level while I was cutting. I don't really know if I'm sure there's a better way to do it somehow with a template. I did try to put my laser level on it and shoot a line across the headliner to follow, but one, it was super bright and my laser level was not that bright, and so I couldn't really see the line. And then as I was cutting, my hand would have been covering up where the laser was shooting in order for me to see what to cut. So I ended up not going that route and just trying to eyeball it as close as I could. And then I took basically 2 measurements and cut a rectangle out, and I realized the front of the van is not a rectangle, but that's just the starting point that I needed to have. And so clearly the rectangle did not fit in there that well. As you can see, a bunch more measuring and trying to get it to fit. And I also realized that there was wiring that was going to get pinched between the shelf and the frame. And so the wiring on the T1N Sprinters, like the 04, or especially ours as being an 04, has the wiring for the interior lights, and it just runs right on top of that little rail there. And I removed it in this case and coiled it up, and basically left it inside the headliner in case I needed to get to it later, because there's a constant 12-volt power source there if I needed it for something driven off the battery. So we finally got the template installed, and I realized that it was nowhere near the middle of the van as close as it was on the outer portions of the van, and that's because the roof is basically circular at the front there. And so I took a tape measure and marked off 3-inch increments and took a measurement to the roof every 3 inches, and then used that to then make a second template. The second template gave me a much more accurate representation of the curvature at the front of the van. And the reason I went through so many templates is to make sure that when I cut the final piece of birch plywood that it would fit perfectly. I didn't want to waste 3 or 4 sheets of really expensive birch plywood basically checking and guessing myself. So I just used some scrap plywood that I had left over to make all the templates. And I got it right on the first try with both sheets of birch plywood that the shelf is made out of. And so that saved me, I think, probably more time than if I had wasted a bunch of birch plywood trying to make the shelf right the whole time without making any templates. And another thing that we're doing here is touching up a couple more places in the van that needed some white paint. We did the wheel welds. There was a couple places in the door where we had welded, and a couple other places that we just wanted to make sure were sealed up and rust free before we put the spray foam in later in the build. And so I've got the second template coming in and checking that everything works on it, and I ended up having to trim the edges of it just a little bit in order to get it to sit down in between the rails of the van up there. And so another thing about the way the shelf fits is it really bolts in the first 10 inches of the shelf, and then as you go toward the front of the van, that's basically an overhang that it gets sealed with spray foam later on in the build, and so I wasn't really worried about the fact that it was not supported, because the 3/4 inch plywood is going to be way overkill for any amount of load that we're going to put in that shelf anyway. My main concern was that when we put the speakers in there that it would rattle. And so before we spray foamed, I did a quick test once I got the speakers installed and made sure that the shelf itself wouldn't rattle. And speaking of speakers, I had my extra speaker wire put in, and so I went in the van and tested out my speakers, made sure they still worked and that everything was right on those. And then I went to make more templates to cut out the holes in my my master template, I guess we'll call it. And so what I did is I took a sheet of cardboard and laid the speaker on it and basically pressed the speaker into the cardboard to make an indention. And then from there I took a razor blade and cut around the cardboard indention and ended up with an oval 6x9 shape. And then I took the master template, put it in the van, traced out where the headliner was on the underside of it so that I could make sure that the speakers wouldn't interfere with the headliner. And then I came back into the shop and put the speakers onto the master template with the line scribed from the headliner and made sure that they would fit. And once I did that, I marked the location that I was happy with on one side, and then from there I measured in each direction so that I would get a constant or a uniform location that I could then transfer to the other side, basically mirror the speaker to the other side of the master template so that it would match when you looked from the driver to the passenger side. So then I took the jigsaw, cut out the openings, did a little test fit, made sure that the speakers fit, and so there you can see the speaker, the cardboard template, and the master template, and the 4 lines that I scribed around the opening in order to get it lined up every time and in the right spot. And I basically measured in from the outside of the template to get those positions correct. So there's what the master template looks like with the speakers installed. And from there, that's when I really realized that I would need a second sheet of plywood in order to make it really look good. So went ahead and fed the birch plywood through the table saw in order to make the top section of the shelf, since we had the template finalized. And it turns out it is really difficult to feed an entire 4x8 sheet of plywood through the table saw. It took me way longer than I thought, but we got it and got it cut down to an approximate size so that we could clamp the template down onto it and trace the template. And one thing you got to keep in mind when you're making and using templates like this is every time you make a template and trace a template, your design or your part will grow slightly. And so I always tried to keep in mind when I was cutting with the jigsaw to always make sure that I was cutting either slightly to the inside of the line or dead on top of the line with the jigsaw, so that my part wouldn't grow as I went through the iterations of the different templates. So we got it clamped down, and I needed to cut the remainder of the 8-foot section of plywood off. So I just made a little quick jig with my level and clamped it down that the circular saw would ride against, so I knew that I would get a nice smooth cut, and then cut the board off. And the reason I usually make little jigs like this to get my cuts perfect is it just bothers me when a piece of lumber is not perfectly square when you're trying to work with it, because then all your measurements, if you don't always take them from the same side, then you can get slightly off. So I always try to end up with square pieces of wood, because if you end up with weird angles here and there, then you end up with a lot more scrap and a lot less usable pieces. So coming around, scribing the lines, I drill my mount holes in order to line it up in the van, and I also drilled through the plywood big enough to get the jigsaw in for the speaker holes. So cleaned up a couple marks and started cutting with the jigsaw, and I quickly realized that I was tearing up the veneer on the birch plywood because I was cutting in the wrong direction. So I ended up having to flip the shelf over and use the other side as the bottom. But I mean, it really didn't matter all that much because you wouldn't have been able to see that edge anyways, because it ended up being under the headliner. But at the time, when I looked at it, I was like, oh, this looks terrible. I can't use this. So I went ahead and flipped it over. But that's another thing. Always try to keep in mind what you'll actually be able to see in the finished product, because I wasted a lot of time here redoing my lines and everything on the template and clamping it down and doing that when I could have just continued cutting and you would have never seen the edge that was messed up anyways. And so cutting out the speaker holes, going around with a jigsaw, the speaker holes ended up being fairly close, not really perfect, as perfect as I would like them to be. I'm definitely not as good with the jigsaw as I'd like to be, so now I've gotten a router, so I try to do as many things with the router as I can and make templates to help me stay lined up where I need to be. But the jigsaw got the job done, and in the end we're covering them up with speaker grills, so you can't see the inside of the holes anyways. So that's another one of those things where it really doesn't have to be perfect because you can't see it. It's hidden. And so we're sanding it down a little bit, and Lauren's going to get a coat of paint on the top surface here. We went with a Sherwin-Williams interior-exterior paint in order to seal and hopefully prevent moisture from getting into the wood. And we went with a gray color. We basically took a piece of the headliner that we had cut off to Lowe's and color matched it as close as we could to the grays that they had in the Sherwin-Williams colors, and it ended up being a pretty good match. And we got a basically the smallest nap roller that we could get in order to get a nice smooth finish. It would be nice if we could spray all the
parts that we needed to paint, it would come out with a lot cleaner finish. But in the end, I was actually really satisfied with the finish that the roller gave us on the piece of lumber. And so getting the paint finished up, and we're getting ready to make the second part of the shelf that goes underneath, and we're going to explain how we came up with the design of that.
So what we've got here is our template that we use to cut out the top portion of the overhead shelf. We've got that portion cut out and the top side of it's painted. So now what we have to do is clean up the edge that touches the headliner. So as you can see here, we don't want this showing in the van. So what we're going to do is we're going to cut another piece of 3/4 inch birch plywood, which is what we've made the top section out of, which this is the top section here. This is actually the template for the top section. And what I'm doing is I'm going to take my pencil and trace around where the headliner is and cut out a secondary template. So basically there will be, once I'm done with this template, it'll be two pieces that you can put together to recreate the top section, or just use the smaller piece to recreate the bottom section. And so basically what it'll do is there'll be a sheet of plywood that butts up to the headliner like that. So basically it'll be about that thick, and it'll go all the way around, so you won't see this gap. It'll just be a clean break in the headliner. So we're going to go ahead and trace it here. Just take a pencil. So now we've got a line going all the way around the outside, and we'll take the jigsaw, cut this piece down to fit that, and we will put the actual piece of birch in for the shelf. We'll test fit to make sure that we cover up all of the sections that we don't want to see in the headliner. And then from there, we'll get a new sheet of birch plywood and take the jigsaw, clamp this template down to it, trace it out, and cut out the actual piece of birch. And then from there, we'll use fasteners to basically screw the two pieces of birch together. And we'll do it from the top, so inside the shelf you'll be able to see the screws, but underneath it'll just look like a clean sheet of birch plywood that we're going to paint gray to match the gray that's in the headliner. So let's get started.
I took the template and measured again just to make sure everything was where it needed to be, and then took the jigsaw and started to cut the template out, and basically making it into two pieces like I talked about earlier, where the piece on the right will be the one that I use to actually make the bottom portion of the shelf, the smaller piece. So I used my level trick again with the circular saw, and one thing that I learned when cutting birch, or any finished grade cabinet plywood for that matter, is that the type of saw blade you use really makes a big difference. So a standard saw that comes like with a blade on it already usually has what's called a ripping or framing blade, and that's a blade that typically has a lower tooth count and the teeth are larger, and so that means that you get less teeth per revolution of the saw blade, which results in a rougher cut. So after making the shelf, before I started on any of the other cabinetry in the van, I actually went out and bought saw blades that have a higher tooth count for both the table saw and the skill saw. And it's amazing, especially the one on the table saw, what a difference it makes when you're feeding nice plywood through. That when it comes out the other side, there's no chipping of the veneer, no pieces that are missing out of the sides of it. It's a super clean cut, so I would highly recommend getting a really good quality saw blade for when you're doing this. I also went and got different blades for my jigsaw as well, which the jigsaw is actually it's my grandfather's jigsaw who passed away, and it's a Craftsman jigsaw that is definitely older than I am, but it cuts super smooth, and I never have any problems with it. It's probably one of the most reliable tools that I have in the shop. I've used it a ton so far in the build. Um, so one thing on this bottom piece that I did is I cut the edges that touch the headliner at two different angles. So on the sides, the headliner comes up almost vertically to the shelf basically, and at the front, the headliner comes up at roughly a 45 to 65 degree angle. And so I put those edges on the bottom piece, so when you push the two together, like you can see here, it kind of pulls the headliner up and you see a nice clean edge all the way around the outside. So I did a test fit. I had to do a little trimming there and then came back and tried it again, and it turns out everything fit just like we wanted it to for the test fit. So we took both pieces out, and I decided to spray the mating surfaces together that mate together with a couple coats of polyurethane. And this is mainly just to seal the wood, because in a van it's technically an interior surface, so in a house you wouldn't have to do something like this. You wouldn't really worry about it because your air conditioning and your heat's going to be running, keeping it at constant humidity and constant temperature all the time. But in a van, I mean, we're going to have the max air fan running, we're going to have the doors open, we're going to be riding down the road with the windows down, so the temperature and humidity are going to be changing in the van a lot. So if you get large swings in temperature and humidity, it can cause wood to swell and contract, and that would end up, there would be gaps and the wood would warp and things of that nature. So basically I just wanted to seal up the wood as best I could. So I sprayed the mating surfaces with polyurethane, went around the edges, and then started painting the bottom side of the shelf gray, the one that you'll actually see in the van. So we got 2 coats of gray paint on that, and again, that's the Sherwin-Williams interior exterior finish paint. It's actually trim paint, but it has some really good qualities that make it where it will stand up to the test of time. So now we're getting ready for the final assembly, going ahead and mounting the speakers, because I knew it would be really tight to get in there against the roof with the speakers in there, and I wouldn't be able to get the screw gun in there to get those bolted down. So I took my time, got the speakers lined up as close as I could get them, and then pre-drilled the holes so I wouldn't split the wood, and inserted the screws into the holes that I drilled and locked the speakers down. And like I said, I wanted to do this because it's really hard to get to the speakers once they're already in the van. The next thing that I did is go ahead and get all of the holes pre-drilled for the screws that I was going to use to attach the 2 parts of the shelf together. So I pre-drilled all of those, and then I took it one step further and went ahead and started all of the screws, so that when I had the shelf installed and I was going to be in a position where I was going to be holding the bottom part of the shelf trying to get it to line up, and I wouldn't really be able to get a screw started and run it through the wood all while holding the shelf. So basically what I did is made it where all I had to do was stick the screw gun up there, find a screw, and just run it down, and it would grab the shelf and pull the gap in, or pull the bottom piece towards the top. So we're getting the top piece installed, getting all of our wiring out of the way. The other thing I did too is cut a square opening in the right side of the shelf, because that's where my S-Bar diesel heater wiring comes up, and the van charge wire that runs to the alternator. So that's something our T1N Sprinter already had the wiring for a house battery to be charged by the alternator. So basically just left it in there and ran it through the shelf with the other 2 wires for the heater. And also the sensor that senses when the passenger door is open also had to be run through the shelf. So that's something I had to just cut it and then extend it and crimp a little extension in there so that that part would open. Because actually when the door sensors don't work on the T1N sprinters, the door locks and the key fob doesn't work because it thinks that the door is either open or closed when it's one or the other, and it won't allow the lock to actuate. So here we're doing a couple measurements, drilling some holes to put the self-tapping sheet metal screws in, and I went with some fairly large sheet metal screws here so that I wouldn't have to worry about it. And I also put a washer, a flat washer, on each of them so I could really pull it down tight and not worry about just pulling through the wood. So got those in, and then I had to run my speaker wire around to my speakers, and I had a lot of extra, so I ended up trimming some down on that. So I trimmed those down, and I made sure that I had my positives and negatives correct for the speaker so that they would be in phase and not sound different. And one thing that I have noticed is that going down the road, with it being so close, like the speakers being so close to your head, you really only hear what's coming out of one speaker. So luckily it's a three-way speaker, so it's got a tweeter, a mid-range, and a bass cone. So the sound quality I think is pretty good. If you're like used to premium sound in your Audi, yeah, it probably doesn't sound that good. But for me, I can hear the music, and that's the most important part to me. So we got the bottom piece put in, and we ran all our screws down, and it ended up, when I was struggling to get it in, I got it slid a little too far to one side, and I didn't notice it until I had run like 15 of the screws in, and so it wouldn't pull together completely. So that's why I've got a clamp there trying to clamp it together and pull it in, and that it pulled together and just pinched the headliner in between. So I ran a couple of extra screws in there so that it wouldn't pull back out. And looking back, I really wish that I had put a good bit of wood glue in between the shelf and the bottom section, but unfortunately I didn't. It seems to be pretty solid for now, but I guess 5 years down the road we'll see how it holds up and see if we really did need to put the glue in. So the last step that we had to do is install our speaker grills, and those basically just cover up the openings, make it where you can't see the unfinished edges of the plywood. And so we're going to go to a short little video here that shows how we did that.
So today we're installing the speaker grills that go over our speaker openings so that you won't see exposed wood when you look at our speakers. So this one we've got held up with 2 screws right now, and we're drilling pilot holes and then putting the screws in so we don't run the risk of splitting our nice birch ply that we have put up on the ceiling here. So we're going to drill this one and then we'll install that one.
Thanks for watching this week's episode of the Van Build series. If you like what you saw, hit that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments, make sure you leave those below and we'll get back to you. If you're ready for more, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you can be ready next week when we post our next video.